Chapter 2. It's not about having friends, it's about being a friend. Unknown. House sitting gig number 3, Amsterdam. I was still nervous about it. What would I find? Could I get Billy to relax enough to be a good source of company? But she would be my only source of company. It would be good to have someone to interact with so I wouldn't fall into depression like in Pin. Here I go. I drove the whole way without camping. I felt guilty driving through Sydney and not stopping at Rachel's. Put your big girl pants on and shoulder your problems yourself. You're tough, I assured myself. I thought about an experience I'd had around 10 years old. I was a room child, always retreating to it as a safe haven, dancing to cassettes, writing, doing art and making myself happy. One particular day I retreated there in a state of misery from something my mother had said to me. I don't remember what it was, but I remember that I was very low. A voice came into my head. It said it was God. I'd had to go to Sunday school and church from a very young age, and it had given me no love, fear or respect for God or organised religion in general. Sure, all 10-year-olds think church is boring, but the idea of God and Jesus usually cracks its way into an impressionable psyche. I was proud of myself for my atheistic views so early on, even if I didn't know the word atheist yet. Anyway, this voice said to me, "Go out into the world and spread love. Your purpose is to spread love." At the back of my child mind, I believed it was my great-grandmother who I'd never met. I was yet to learn that she'd been a medium who contacted people's dead relatives and delivered messages to them. I didn't know much about her, but I instinctively knew it was her. Perhaps she was trying to turn me Christian beyond the grave. So I walked out of that room, my sanctuary, with my head held high and full of love and good spirits. I can't remember what happened next, whether it worked. I doubt it, as I went back to my usual form of coping, be a squeaky wheel in the family to fight for my autonomy. I was way too young to be enlightened, but I never forgot that feeling. It wasn't Christianity, it was closer to Buddhism. I loved that and hoped I could achieve it as an adult, hence my curiosity about Buddhism. I didn't want to be one of those white women converts who become nuns. Buddhism wasn't my religion to follow, but its philosophy sure would help. And here I am now, wandering the earth, coming across all sorts of people, both on the road and through living in their homes. And I was spreading love and positivity, even if just through my need to people please for my survival. Even Barbara had put a nice little message at the end of the hoodie text. "It was nice to meet you, gypsy girl. Have a great journey." She got it. And keeping my pain to myself and broadcasting love like a little Wi-Fi signal would surely heal the pain. I was determined to be this. No more dry drunk self-pity resulting in a wagon fall. As a woman in the fast book group had reminded me, you're luckier than most, so have an attitude of gratitude. Billy greeted me at the second gate that fences the yard, or the grounds as I came to call them. She drew it wide open so I could drive my van up near the studio. I was nervous as I stepped out of the van, the dogs circling like sharks. Emmy was friendlier this time, but still jumping on me like a puppy. The studio looked fabulous now that it was empty. Billy took me through all the appliances. The gas stove worked but needed to be checked for safety, so my cooking would all be done on a little electric 2-plate with an oven the size of a microwave. As long as it would heat my Italian espresso percolator, I was happy. I unloaded my week or so worth of groceries since Sheepton held the closest shops 45 minutes drive away. It was time to be around the hounds. I knew I had to do this. King was the top dog and always led the game. I picked up one of the toys strewn around the tennis court and threw it. He'd grab it, fighting Emmy for it the whole time. He never brought it back, instead waiting for me to come near him as though I was going to fight him for it, like Emmy. Like children playing tag. Emmy jumped on him and mouthed his face. He growled at her, then looked at me. I could tell he was sick of her. She was a new addition. Her owners had died in a car accident when she was a pup, and she'd come as is. Billy had never trained her puppy ways out of her, telling me she'd grow out of it. The third shepherd, Pedro, was old and sweet-tempered. I couldn't pat the others, but I could pat Pedro. He'd probably been there the longest, but he was now on the bottom rung. I felt so sorry for him when he'd sadly whine while either digging up or attempting to pick up previously dug up rocks. His contribution to the game, as there was no way he'd be able to take a toy from King. His teeth were all broken from this rock game. I figured it was his way of participating, as the two other dogs weren't interested in his rocks. I'd also pretend to take rocks from him while simultaneously chasing King. Occasionally King would growl at Pedro, forcing him to drop his rock. King sniffed the rock but went back to his toys. King the bully. Billy came out of the house after a while and said she'd been watching from inside. She voiced her delight at watching all the dogs' tails wagging as we played. It was on the tip of my tongue to say, I'm gaining their trust for my own survival as they make me nervous. Instead, I said that the dogs liked me because I was submissive. I was one of them. I visibly saw Billy's ears prick up at the mention of submission. Oh, you'd definitely be into BDSM, I thought to myself, and no prizes for guessing which role you'd take when it came to dom and sub options. I regretted making the submission comment. Would she now try to dominate me? I don't know why I said it, as during my past experimentation into BDSM, I was always dom. It was different with dogs. One wrong move and these things would rip me apart, kill me. I'm sure Billy liked this potential in her house. I gave her a nickname in my head, the Mistress. She was the mistress of this property, of her dogs, and of whatever relationship she'd been in. This sealed her status as a lone woman. Too much to handle. She reminded me of an actual mistress I'd had in my life. When I was in year 10 at boarding school, the old mistress of the boarding house retired. A tall, slender, fear-instilling woman in her 60s with ice blue eyes, who would have been beautiful when she was younger. The next one followed suit. A tall, younger woman with a dominatrix black bob and brutal fringe. Her name, which I can't repeat here, sounded like a literal assumed dominatrix name, particularly when we had to preface it with Ms., the feminist development in the 80s that enabled women to keep their maiden name even when married. She lived in and ruled over the boarding house with an iron fist, while occupying her living quarters with her ex-rugby league player husband. Such an unlikely pairing, but in hindsight, those tough boys liked a bit of female domination, a kink that offset their domination everywhere else in life in their physically intimidating footy-playing bodies. And it was this mistress who unwittingly introduced me to the world of BDSM. One of my friends, Louise, had much older brothers and sisters. One day at her eldest brother's house where he was supposedly minding them, she and her younger brothers had popped one of his porn videos into the VCR player. It was a BDSM video. Louise obviously had been shocked by it as a young'un and had psychologically dealt with it by making constant jokes about BDSM. She only knew it by the term bondage. She'd draw maces with spikes and chains and assume a character that was a cross between a dominatrix and Freddy Krueger, another movie which fucked her up. The mistress would have been the trigger for all her references. We'd sit together in the mistress's ancient history class, and Louise would say to me, "Pretend everything she says is about bondage." The jokes wrote themselves, and I would be crying with laughter and trying to repress it. This was the highlight of my boarding school years. I remember Louise telling me later in life that the mistress was friends with this older BDSM-loving brother. She even expressed a suspicion that the mistress was punking her. "Did you notice how we never got in trouble for laughing?" she asked me. Quite pissed off about it too. Poor Louise, it was a lot to deal with, and I was too young to be emotional support, just there for the shits and giggles. I really wondered if I'd be able to bring love and light to this current mistress, for she is very powerful. We sat outside one evening for a catch-up and she told me all about her life. She suffered with a narc mother and we bonded over the ordeal that was. Billy really dominated the conversation though. All of her sufferings trumped mine. She'd been kicked out of home, went through the foster care system, had shot a guy in self-defense in her younger years, had been sexually abused as a child by a family acquaintance, was estranged from her brother, the golden child, because of the family dynamic, had talked her father down from a suicide attempt. All of this would normally incite as much empathy as I was able to give. What a tragic life. But she trauma dumped on me. I left that encounter feeling drained and resentful towards her. Damn, how was I going to manage this? I had no choice but to defer to her as the more aggrieved party, as though it was a competition. Oh well, in some ways it made me glad I didn't have to go through all that shit. And I was a good listener, supportive, so trauma dumps happened to me often. Ever the empath. Still, I was smarting from dealing with my own family trauma, so my depression returned. I went into a social media doom scrolling habit, Instagram being my drug of choice. I consistently did this anyway, first thing in the morning, last thing before falling asleep at night. Sometimes on waking in the early hours that were too early to rising. In the middle of the day when I needed a distraction from my depression, I sought the dopamine even though it wasn't natural. I consumed mostly feminist content with both woke men and millennial and Gen Y women creators. A post by a young US woman really summarized my beliefs. She was providing hetero relationship advice, and her standard answer to all problems was, they hate you, they hate us, they hate themselves. The sooner you realize that, the better. As a partnerless, childless woman, I realized this, so felt ahead of the game. Though despite believing this, I'd had a hankering all through my 40s and now 50s for young male lovers. My tastes develop over time and went as follows. They must be under 30 years old because males over 30 have discovered that the world revolves around them when it comes to the large amounts of money they earn in Australia. Plus women their age seeking life partners. They are more popular on dating sites, and because of this, they usually go for women in their 20s anyway. I tried a couple in the beginning of my hookup phase and found they were too arrogant. And as one self-professed cougar described in an online post, at least men in their 20s knew they were dickheads. 30-plus males were set in their ways, no hope of changing them. Males in their 20s are sexually inexperienced. This is not welcomed by a lot of women, but I liked it. I liked that they were sometimes nervous, eager to learn from an older woman, and able to be instructed on how to please a woman. On saying this, another rule I have is no white Aussie males. They've mostly grown up sheltered from the real world, and because of this immaturity, they haven't grown out of the high school peer pressure that shaped them into disgusting misogynistic grommets. I got very badly burnt by one of them. More on that later. So my dating pool came down to non-Aussie males in their 20s. There are certain cultures I avoid in this pool also. I'm not racist, it's purely for safety. The attitudes to women who have premarital sex is quite bad in Indian, Pakistani and Sri Lankan cultures. Add to that Middle Eastern and South American cultures. Religion plays a big part in their attitudes and it's easier to avoid them. Unfortunately, Asian cultures aren't crash hot with their attitudes to women either, which is a shame because there are so many of them on dating apps. This isn't because of culture and religion, it's because they are very into tech, chronically online, and more likely to be red-pilled because they aren't popular with white or Asian women. So it becomes our fault. Ditto for Hindi culture. This leaves African, Polynesian, South Sea Islander and Aboriginal cultures. I do love Aboriginal males, but I have to be careful because they're usually into long-term relationships. Same for Maori, Tongan and Samoan cultures. They're family orientated and they're not going to find what they're looking for with me. My go-to fail-safe culture is African nations. There's a lot of young African males in Australia on working visas, usually doing the very hard job of caring for disabled adults. This, along with growing up in African nations with a no-nonsense African mother, makes them more mature for their young age. They are in Australia on their own, so they're years ahead of Aussie males their age. Education is highly valued in African nations, so they're more intelligent than an Aussie male their age too. Sure, they're religious, but that all goes out the door when it comes to premarital sex. And I'll admit it's for superficial reasons also. West, Central and South African nation people are beautiful looking. I can't believe there was ever the attitude that black people are ugly. All of their features, their skin and their physiques are superior. I'm sure white males assume white women's attraction is because they have large dicks. This is a phallic fallacy. Teehee. They range in all sizes like European descended males. In fact, in my experience of dining from the international smorgasbord that's on offer in Australia, Italian and Sicilian men have, on average, above average dick length and girth. This so-called advantage is no advantage if they can't use it right. And that's why I prefer African nation males. They know how to use whatever they've got. They have rhythm in their hips because they know how to move, to dance. This isn't a racial stereotype. They're sometimes taught to dance from a young age as part of culture. Aussie culture determines that dancing for men is considered feminine. They could become better lovers if they just practiced dancing and getting in touch with their bodies. Instead, they play rough sports like league, union and AFL, which only teaches them how to tackle and touch each other up in a homoerotic way. I have a strict rule about no pro football players. I've matched with some. Also no bikies and no military. All three have a terrible culture of gang rape. I found that out the hard way when I hooked up with a Navy male my age. More on that later. So my preferences determine that I'm a snow bunny on paper. I disagree with this. I've hooked up with young African males who moved here with families when they were young and attended school here. There's a big difference with these ones. They aren't as bad as Aussie males, but they're pretty close. I'm sure their parents are disappointed in how much influence Aussie culture has had on them, and gang culture that's very prevalent in outer suburbs of cities. I've hooked up with one of these who basically said that he got into security because of his size and then gangs despite his Kenyan mother being a doctor. He remembered his childhood in culture of origin, saying that as kids they weren't even allowed to buy Coca-Cola from the corner store. The owners looked out for all the kids and their health. Now he was pretty overweight from living in Australia. He was still attractive though. That's the strength of good genes. He held some nice aspects of culture, such as being a great conversationalist, but he wasn't respectful. So it's the cultural upbringing that I'm attracted to. And on paper I'd be considered a MILF, a cougar. I disagree with these stereotypes also. I'm not a mother, never have been. I don't mother my lovers, and I don't pursue them in a cougar fashion. We choose each other equally. In fact, I've been pursued by an African nation male. He was a tradie at an upmarket desert resort I stayed at on one of my travels. He asked me to join him and I went along with it. No chase on my behalf. And because he was Aussie raised, he turned hit and quit straight after the act. I'm not looking for relationships with any of the males that I choose or who choose me, but I'm open to repeat sessions, if they're respectful. Another African male who proved my theory that I prefer males who've been brought up in African nations was an American basketballer. Being a pro sportsman probably had a lot to do with his disrespectful attitude. Either way, I made a mental note to avoid them. Sorry to not elaborate, but I do need a whole chapter to go into the more on that later ones. It's important to mention that I had experienced African nation males when I lived in Thailand. That too needs its own chapter. Suffice to say that because of the poverty and desperation of them, I was way more in danger than any disrespectful males I'd come across in Australia. It wasn't misogyny though, it wasn't even personal. It was survival for them. Living where I am, a lengthy drive from both the capital city and the regional centre of Sheepton, and in a place that wasn't my own, I didn't expect to continue with my hookups like I had when I lived in Beach Town, and also on my lap around Australia. Adelaide and Perth delivered what I wanted. I'd have to ignore my libido. This would be tough. Tinder was my app of choice. I'd used it like Uber Eats, with lovers delivered to my door in the places I'd lived during the 5 years or so. Melbourne, Beach Town, and the State Forest in the Hunter region. It seems reckless to bring lovers to my home, but it's safer than going to theirs. Who knows what hidden cameras they had. I choose but don't trust young males in that regard. And the apartment blocks I was living in had neighbours next door and security doors on the outside. Choosing males that were here on visas generally afforded the added security of them not wanting to tangle with the law for fear of being kicked out. I'm smart enough to know that any male is capable of choking and other rough stuff from watching porn. On the topic of street smartness, it's important to mention that I was aware that some males from African nations could have been choosing me for reasons other than sex, such as a visa route or money. I'd never forked out money, but if I did, it'd be for escort services rendered. Why not, if they were good looking and good in the sack? Most young guys were already from middle and upper class families back in their country of origin. Australian laws determine that they have to have a fair whack of cash as the deposit to live here anyway, and all of them professed a love of their country, which I really admired. Australia is safe and as a result more boring than their countries of origin. We don't have a dynamic Aussie culture. So I never got hit up for a visa marriage or money. When I lived in the state forest at Madeline's, my position also added a sinister layer to the hookups. I remember one young male telling me that he was worried that he was going to lose a kidney as he followed me in his vehicle up in the mountainous 7-kilometre winding dirt road. He said the deeper we went into the forest, the more nervous he got about losing more than a kidney. I found this funny. Let the shoe be on the other foot for once. Still, they risk their lives for sex. Young, dumb, and full of cum. I figured the same things would happen here. Males getting nervous about going to a middle of nowhere destination. Hell, I'd been nervous when I came to this place. Billy, in her forthright story deliveries, had mentioned that we're safe here because there's a lot of places on the property to bury bodies. I found this funny and very reassuring in a separatist, feminist kind of way. Us against any male intruders who are stupid enough to try. Despite this tough attitude, Billy was pretty heavy on security. The dogs offered security enough, I would have thought. There were sensor lights mounted about the grounds and outside our house and the studio. I don't have crim friends, but I'm aware that many of them go overboard with electronic security because of their self-created enemies. I push the thought to the back of my mind that Billy may be involved in crim activities. There was no evidence of a drug lab or even plants being grown on the property. Maybe she was just paranoid, living alone as a woman. Billy would go to Sydney a few days or a week at a time. I love these times being alone on the property. My daily routine was feeding, letting the chooks out and collecting their eggs, a couple of which I'd have for my breakfast. Feeding the housebound cats breakfast in their little outdoor yard that Billy had kindly built for them with building site fences. In the early evening, herding and shutting the chooks into their coop and feeding the dogs dinner in the house. This made me nervous as they circled me while I dished out their dry food, wet meat and doggy spam roll. They never jumped up and I was grateful for them being taught some manners. And as for me, days spent scrolling on Instagram generally resulted in me falling into a depression by the afternoon. Then I'd get going on some streaming series, well-written, intelligent soap operas that are designed to hook you into an addiction. I'd be able to lose myself in them, to forget my self-pity. I started an exercise regime in the morning. I used to love and attend Kundalini yoga classes in the cities I'd lived in. A very good podcast I listened to fall asleep at night was Conspirituality. A very good podcast I listened to fall asleep at night was called Conspirituality. The podcasters exposed all sorts of grifts and crimes in the wellness world, and I respected them because they'd broken out of yoga and meditation cults themselves. They covered the guru who brought Kundalini to the Western world. Typically, he was like all other cult leaders, a sexual predator. So I used all the stretches and exercises in YouTube Kundalini videos to make my own vid, omitting the chants but retaining the breath of fire, which they claimed caused a vibrating Kundalini energy throughout the body. I can attest to the fact that it's just hyperventilation and it makes your body tremble with dizziness. I like the feeling though. Despite this, I still felt the afternoon blues. I attributed this to having to live in my head all day. When I rose in the morning, I was always fresh and ready to greet the day. I walked the dogs around the lake while they swam and played. I cooked a nice mid-morning cafe-style brunch at breakfast hour. It was a healthy routine, but it wasn't enough. I yearned for a time-filling, crafty hobby or a return to the art I used to love creating. When I lived in the state forest, I got into jigsaw puzzles for a while there, even going to the trouble of finding two of the same brand in op shops and splicing the two different scene halves together, for the pieces are cut exactly the same. I even got into some drawing, copying mandalas from adult colouring books into my own designs. My Aries nature means that I get sick of things once I've conquered them to my abilities. I don't form an obsession with them and improve my skills. During this time, even though we both kept ourselves to ourselves, always communicating via WhatsApp with her even when she was here, I relied quite heavily on Billy for company to keep me sane. Our chats would usually be conducted while I was outside on the tennis court playing with the dogs. We'd stand a good distance from each other, one of us having to look into the sun and almost shouting at each other. I figured this was because she didn't want to get distracted as she was working from home after all. Despite this, she always got into some heavy topic about her past that needed to be treated with empathy. It was a touch exhausting sometimes, but I had nothing else to do. Occasionally, I'd catch a ride with her into Sheepton to pick up supplies. She'd zoom out of the side road onto the federal highway in a fully electric car. It was thrilling. We'd split up in whatever supermarket we were in. Shopping together was too close, too much like a couple. I'd always hope I didn't run into her in the aisles in that way that can be awkward if you've already greeted someone you know and said your goodbyes during that convo. Once we went out to dinner in a little village pub nearby. She said the owner, an ex-copper, knew her father, also an ex-copper. I noticed how uptight she seemed on this visit, interacting with the public. I wanted to make things easier for her, but didn't know how, being socially awkward myself. No, I'll disagree with myself on this. I'm not socially awkward. I'm down to earth and can yarn with anyone in that small town way. I held back because I didn't want to dominate the conversation. We ate our pub grub stiffly at a little table inside the maze of rooms in the beautiful old pub. A couple of young women sat near us and we struck up a conversation with them. One of them was androgynous and probably gay. I don't know how we got onto the topic of trans people, but I started to yap my head off. I'm a trans ally, but it's a subject I knew little about and it wasn't my place to yap. No one seemed to mind, but I noted how nervous I was around Billy. On our way back to the property, we headed north along the federal highway for a bit and then took a right turn onto a sealed, pockmarked road that led to other smaller villages. The dirt road that ran past Billy's property lay about 3 kilometres along this road. It was a very quiet area once you got off the busyness of the 4-lane highway. At this highway turn-off, there were several vehicles parked up on what looked like a truck layover area. The pockmarks in the road were a result of dump trucks coming through. There were males scattered about, leaning on their vehicles. I joked to Billy, "What happens there? Is it a gay bid or something?" This was funny because the vehicles were Amarok utes and souped-up Commodores. Fuckwit trucks, I called them, because the males who drove them wanted to appear masculine. The Commodores I called bogan cars. Billy replied that she didn't know. "Maybe a drug deal?" she queried. I would have thought it was too much of an obvious spot, but what did I know? I did know that this was in the federal police zone. Once on a motorcycle ride back from Sheepton, I'd seen a biker standing by the road with an unmarked police car and a copper going over his bike. A bit further up, another two and another unmarked car. The coppers' uniforms were dark, so federal coppers. The bikers must have been bikies because they were stripped down to their singlets and boxers on this very chilly afternoon. As I whizzed by, my mufflerless engine hum made the coppers and bikies alike all look up to check out the noise. They might have thought I'm another member. I laughed to myself, safe in the knowledge that bikies never patched a woman in, let alone let them ride with them. I had no romantic notions about outlaw bike clubs. I wasn't that bogan. Billy was generally pretty easy to read. I searched her words and reactions for any sign that she might be angry with me. I was usually a pretty easygoing conversationalist and could yarn with anyone about anything. I guess I looked for anything suspicious with her, as she had an intensity to her that could have been cause for alarm. I knew her father was an ex-copper. She also knew some federal coppers, an ex-girlfriend or friend or something, and she'd worked in the Department of Defense in a previous role. I figured she was pretty straight when it came to law-abiding. The reason I was curious about this is she spoke of a brother who'd been in trouble with the law. It's not nice to stereotype, but because he was Islander, I wondered if he was into gang stuff. Billy didn't approve of him, so I was relieved at that. There was one thing though. When I'd first arrived, Billy had taken me through the Wi-Fi situation. The studio had terrible reception and she'd bought a portable modem, apologising that it was Starlink. I can't stand Elon Musk, but it's good reception for here. I had no clue either way and hooked my phone, tablet and laptop up to it, proceeded to drain the limited data. The first time I opened my internet banking app, I noticed that the app's opening page was a picture of Montreal, Canada instead of Sydney. This is odd, I thought to myself. I opened up maps and checked my location. It put me on a country road in rural Quebec. That's really odd, I thought, and it's really going to fuck with my banking app. I took my phone and tablet down to the lake where there was more reception. It gave my current location and I fiddled with the settings on my banking app to make it correct. Must be a Starlink thing where it bounces off a group satellite or something. I asked Billy about it on one of our encounters in the grounds. She said she didn't know why it did that. I talked myself out of concern and figured that she mustn't have that problem from her house Wi-Fi, so genuinely didn't know. She offered that I use the house Wi-Fi. I'd seen 2 others pop up when I connected, both named after the property, followed by 1 and 2. Their signals were too weak, so I worked around it by putting my phone in a far corner window, still in the studio, and hotspotted off it to watch streaming services on my laptop. Without internet, I don't cope too well. This is ironic as my chronically online status also causes me to not cope so well. Oh well, I needed the distraction. This meant that I couldn't scroll on my phone up in the loft before bed and when I first woke up in the morning. This was nothing but a good thing. My ego was sure dying a death. I often felt small, anonymous, and not part of society. The way our lives operate, the way we had to live, the lack of community brought about by the nuclear family, the unhappiness of married mothers compared to single women, all contributed to my notion of not wanting to be a part of society anyway. But, as a good friend observed, one who was in this latter category, I needed to find my tribe. In many ways, I classified Billy as my tribe. I was still unsure about her though.